Good morning, good morning. Oh, it's a very wet old morning here in Chard. But we begin our, what I called yesterday a marathon. Don't think of it in those terms. Although some people really enjoy a marathon. This reading of Romans is very different to reading the shorter letters. It's really quite, would take a lot of determination to read the whole of Romans in one sitting. We're not doing that, we're doing it chapter by chapter. But one or two introductory things about Romans. It was written probably about AD 56, and it's different to the other letters because this was a church that Paul had never visited. He did go to Rome when he appealed to Caesar and he was taken to Rome, but he had never visited Rome, and so this letter does not quite have the same personal feel that the other letters that we have read, because all the other letters were written to people, to churches that Paul had founded, or to people that Paul knew very well. So there's a formality about this letter, really, and what he seems to be doing is writing to the people of Rome with the expectation and hope that he would visit them. But he seems to have taken time to make sure that what they believed about Jesus was correct and what they believed about the gospel was correct. It was his determination never to minister where other people were ministering, and so challenge, as it were, or get in the way of somebody else's ministry. It wasn't his thing to do. So, but he does express his great hope that one day he will visit them in Rome, and of course he did. And we don't actually know who founded the church in Rome, although right back at the beginning of Acts, on the day of Pentecost, there were people from Rome there in Jerusalem when the day of Pentecost happened and the Holy Spirit was given. And it may well be that some of the people who, in that crowd who turned to faith, came from Rome and carried their faith home with them. So we don't actually know very much about the church in Rome, except that there are lots of archaeological artifacts and so on that have been found in the catacombs beneath Rome that are obviously from the early Christian settlement there. So the first chapter, it's a very interesting chapter, isn't it? Several things stood out to me as I read it. The first was the proof of who Jesus was, descended in verse 3, descended from David according to the flesh, and designated Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. So here we are right at the beginning of Romans, with Paul making it quite clear that faith in Jesus must include belief that he came back from the dead. This is an essential part of the gospel. And for some people, it's the trickiest bit. There are some people who simply cannot believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Indeed, there are some people who pilgrimage to Jerusalem and worship at the empty tomb, which may not even be the tomb that was used, but it has been always acknowledged. There's 2 or 3 sites, and people get very emotional and worship at the tomb, the empty tomb. But that is a weird thing, isn't it, when you think about it? Nobody, why would somebody go and visit a grave that is where the body isn't? Interesting, isn't it? Last year was my 70th birthday last year, and I had planned to go on a special trip up to Leicester because I've always had a fascination for Richard III, and when his body was found and laid to rest in the cathedral there, it became one of my great desires, really, to go and just see where they've laid the remains of what was, for me, was a misunderstood and misrepresented king, accused of all sorts of things, and I'm not terribly convinced about. Anyway, that's another story. But I wanted to go and see where these bones had been laid, to see the tomb that they'd made for him. Now, what would be the point if they'd made a tomb for Richard III and never put him in it? What would be the point of going there? You might as well go just to look at a painting of him or of the person you're thinking of. And the fascinating thing about the empty tomb in Jerusalem, of course, is that nobody is absolutely sure where it was. And why is that? It's because the early church, when Jesus rose from the dead, didn't even visit it after he'd risen. They didn't mark it. They didn't remember where it was. It was centuries later that the religious nature of faith that develops, it became an iconic place to go to, the empty tomb, a place to go and venerate and worship. And that's why nobody's absolutely sure which one it is, because nobody marked it at the time, because he wasn't there. He wasn't there. He isn't there. So the resurrection is vitally important for our faith. And Paul starts his book mentioning the resurrection. And that's wonderful. And then there is this other verse that stood out to me, which is in verse 21. And Paul has said, that in the whole of nature, the whole of nature screams out that it's been created by an amazing mind. The design, the more we study, the more we know. And Paul was saying this before microscopes, before the ability to see into the stars and beyond our atmosphere, before all the great scientific discoveries, before we could see the microbes and the bacteria and understand, before we ever understood how the bodies function, before we ever knew about the blood system or the lymph system, and that's just in our own bodies, before we understood any of that, before we understood any of the way that creatures are made in the kind of detail that we understand now, he says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature, his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. And he goes on with what some people have described as the downward steps of degradation, as it were. Though they knew God, they did not honour him as God or give thanks to him. They became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. So there's a sort of 4-step thing. First of all, not honouring God, not worshipping him, not giving him the place that's due to him. That's the first thing. Not giving thanks to him, not thanking him for the world he made, for his creation, not thanking him, being ungrateful. And then their minds become futile, their thinking becomes futile, and their senseless minds become dark, and evil has arrived. It's a very interesting chapter, isn't it? If you want to read it again, that would be great, but today's task is to read chapter 2, and I'll see you tomorrow. God bless. Bye-bye.